Is sci-fi primitive compared to current and emerging technologies? Can the future of technology be reimagined? We've got a riveting discussion now. Multi-award-winning science fiction authors Cory Doctorow and Charles Stross come together to explore how fictional works can aid visions of the future. Join us now for a transatlantic fireside discussion, which is going to close the 2021 World Ethical Data Forum's final day. Take it away, fellas.
Well, hello. I think the fire that we are beside is the earth, which is on fire. And we are here for our fireside chat to talk about science fiction. I'm Cory Doctorow. This is my colleague and collaborator, Charlie Stross.
Hi.
Hi. So I think our order of service here is that I'm going to speak briefly about my view about science fiction's relationship to the future, which may be disappointingly close to Charlie's view. We may just find ourselves in vigorous disagreement, but that's never stopped us from having a frothy and useful and interesting conversation that's suitably spittle-flecked for two very excitable science fiction writers. And then Charlie will do the same, and then we will proceed with discussions, and comments and questions you raise are going to be dropped into our own private chat by the producers, such that we can see them and key off of them should we choose to. If we don't, it's nothing personal. We just didn't find it interesting enough. So I want to start by saying that I think science fiction's relationship to the future is absolutely not predictive. And thank goodness. If the future is predictable, then it is arriving on rails. Nothing we do makes a difference. There is something incredibly fatalistic about the view that the future can be known. Because it implies that human action is irrelevant to the future that we arrive at. And instead, I think science fiction is much more like an oracle. If you get all the people whose voices we're willing to hear from to write down their aspirations and fears about technology and its relationship to society, then all of the editors who are in a position to gatekeep those aspirations and fears choose among them and pick some that they think the public will want. And then the great public chooses among those, like an ideomotor response on a planchette on a Ouija board, and points towards one or more of those futures. And it doesn't tell you what's going on in the future in the same way that the planchette on a Ouija board doesn't tell you what's going on in the spirit realm, but it tells you an awful lot about what's going on with the audience, with the writer and with the audience. And this is why we see the periodic surge and retreat of, say, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Or as it should be properly called, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein's monster, in which the various things that story can be about, hubris and technology run amok, and the power of technology to extend life, and foolishness and short-sightedness, and whatever, all those different valences that story has at different times. We feel them in different ways, and that story comes back again and again and again. It enjoys the remarkable advantage of being in the public domain, some that very few stories with any currency are, and so it can be very trivially revived when the moment comes for it. And to observe that science fiction is a good way to know about the present is not to omit science fiction's role in the future. The present is the standing wave in which the past is becoming the future. If you know a lot about the present, you know more about the future. You are better prepared for the future. And science fiction can be a kind of intuition pump that tells you what your reflexive view should be of different futuristic events when and if they arrive. And that also has an enormous impact on what kind of future we have, but not because it's been predicted, but because it's been inscribed upon our imaginations. So with that, I'll hand it over to our esteemed Mr. Stross and see what he has to say.
Yeah. I mostly agree with everything Cory's just said about science fiction, but I'd like to add a few different angles to it. For starters, science fiction is, when all is said and done, it's commercial art. The job of a science fiction writer is to, above all, to tell an entertaining story. If you don't tell an entertaining story, well, you're a storyteller, you put your bowl out and people throw coins in it. You don't get paid. So, as it said on my blog for years, I tell lies for money. And you've got to bear in mind that if the lies are not entertaining, people won't give you money. So they have to play into the cognitive biases and expectations of the audience. And that's point number one, that science fiction isn't a unbiased guide to the future or to what we think the future will be. It's a selective guide. A second point here is we are always rooting our predictions about the future in the present. It's depictions of the future in science fiction are very much a reflection of the concerns and preoccupations of the present day, using the future as a dark mirror, as it were, to sort of examine our fears from a different angle. For example, if you read the works of Philip K. Dick, you don't have to go very, very far to stub your toes on the intense paranoia of the Cold War era in which he was writing. If you look at John W. Campbell's work, very famous, very eminent editor who shaped the genre immensely between the 1930s and the 1960s, he was a flaming racist, a technocrat. Yeah, absolutely. And what he published in, was it Amazing that he was editing at the time? What he was publishing was to some extent selective for what pushed a political agenda. The classic science fiction short story, The Cold Equations, I'm trying to remember the author's name, having a senior moment here. It's the tale of a spaceman, this was sort of early 1950s, who is on a shuttlecraft, dropping off a starship, but is passing a solar system. There's a colony in the solar system. It has a plague outbreak. He has a vaccine or a cure for plague. It's a very lightweight shuttle. There's not much margin of error. His job is to get the cure to the colony before everybody there dies. And he discovers a 12-year-old girl has stowed away on his ship. And spoilers abound, she dies because basically there's not enough fuel reserve to get there and complete the mission and take the weight of the stowaway. And apparently that's not the way the story originally ran. Campbell sent the story back to the author 3 times requesting a rewrite before he got it right, with the ending that Campbell was looking for, which was one that basically said you can't play games with the laws of physics. Physics über alle, basically. A rather totalitarian idea, and one that doesn't actually hold water if you look at it. I mean, nobody in the modern aerospace industry builds vehicles with 0 margin of error. It's just ludicrous. But nevertheless, for somebody with an ideological axe to grind and an editor's bully pulpit, you can do a lot of damage. Now, the other thing I'd like to note is I think this century it's been getting increasingly difficult to write predictive mode SF. I mean, most SF is actually metaphorical or it's escapist entertainment. It's rare to actually try and predict the future, although I have a couple of times written books in which I was attempting to portray a future 10 years out. I was writing police procedurals about computer-related crimes that don't exist yet, basically. And I came up with a recipe for trying to come up with a setting for such fiction. The first thing to recognize if you're setting a fiction 10 years in the future is that 90% of that future is already here today and it's around us. I'm in the UK. The average home in the UK is 75 years old. Our houses are really ancient. So it's a fair bet that in 10 years' time, about 80 to 90% of the housing stock will be the same. Cars, similarly, cars these days last more than a decade. Half the cars on the road in 10 years' time are already on the road today. People are born, people grow old, people die, but we know that there'll be maybe 15% of those who are here today will be dead, another 15% will be around, and everybody else will be a bit older. But you can basically predict who will be there for the most part. So when I say the world in 10 years' time is 90% already here today, that's what I mean. But that leaves another 10%. And my formula back in the noughties, in 2005 to 2010, was 9% is predictable from roadmaps. For example, you can look at Intel's roadmap for where they're going with semiconductors or at ARMS and take a fairly good stab at the performance envelope of smartphones or laptop computers in 10 years' time. You know, this stuff is pretty much determined by the cadence of Moore's law, improvements in node size in semiconductor fabs, and similarly. You can look at medications that are in clinical trials and you'll be able to guess what's going to be there. But finally, there's another 1%, which is from the who ordered that department, which you just cannot predict no matter what happens. Take COVID-19, for example. Back in 1994, I read a book by Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Laurie Garrett called The Coming Plague, which pretty much predicted the emergence of zoonoses and viral pandemics that would hit the human population sometime within the next few decades. It's about as inevitable as another big earthquake hitting the San Andreas Fault. Nobody can predict when it will happen. You can just predict that it will happen. But the consequences of COVID-19 coinciding with an American president who would double down on selling bleach irrigation as a quack cure and denounce vaccination as a communist plot or something. Who ordered that? I mean, there is stuff that you just cannot put into a work of fiction and have anybody believe it. If I tried to write a zombie pandemic novel using events that had occurred during COVID-19, I would be having to have a large number of people be zombie denialists and a bunch of others holding zombie virus parties in which you too can be bitten early by a zombie to build up your herd immunity. And the point I've been circling and trying to get to is back a decade or so ago, it was a 99.1% division between eminently predictable because it's already here, 9% on the roadmap, and 1% random, weird, crazy shit. And today I think it's more like 80% already here, 15% on the roadmap, and 5% out of the random junk drawer of a hallucinating god, basically. It is getting much, much harder to predict where we're going in the next few years because there's so much random stuff happening. Cory, any comments?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful formulation. And I was very struck when you posted that essay about the future being 90% here. It really made me think hard. And I take on board all you say about the nonlinear nature of some of the things that have happened in the last few years, the sense that we've been just horribly buffeted by very strange change that we didn't anticipate, or that we couldn't have easily anticipated. I think, though, that the hopeful side of all that is that if the future is not inscribed, right, if it's only 80% and falling, that represents the space in which human action might make a difference. Right. And maybe it'll make a difference for the worse. Right. But it might make a difference for the better. And when we were corresponding about this and getting ready, I mentioned Ada Palmer, who's quite a remarkable person. She's a science fiction and fantasy writer, but that's her side hustle. Her primary gig is that she's a tenured professor of Renaissance Italy at Renaissance Italian history at the University of Chicago, where her discipline is studying heterodox and banned information during the Inquisitions, homosexuality, cultism, occultism, Satanism, heresy, all kinds of interesting and wonderful stuff. Ada is also a fantastic librettist and singer and has a band called Sassafras that has written an opera about the Icelandic skalds, among many other things. And I really commend her to your attention, Ada Palmer. But the reason I bring her up is that she is infamous at the University of Chicago for doing this annual exercise with her incoming undergraduate class. She has them participate in a multi-week live-action role-playing game in which they reenact the election of the Medici's Pope. And Ada has, I knew you'd like that. Ada has a Google alert for when theater companies anywhere in America are selling their costumes. And she has filled her office storeroom with Renaissance costumes. And for multiple weeks, her students are assigned the identity of a real historic personage from the election of the Medici's Pope. And they wheel and deal. They form alliances, they betray each other, they traffic in secrets. And then at the end, there is a kind of climax in which they all dress in costume. And they rock up to an auditorium at the University of Chicago, which has some very fancy auditoriums. If you are the birthplace of neoliberal capitalism, you are a well-endowed university. And they invest the Pope. And every year, there are 4 final candidates. and every year, two of them are the same, because the great forces of history bore down on that moment to ensure that two people would always be in the running to be Pope. And every year, two of them are different, and they're never the same from year to year. And that tells you that although there are great forces of history that bear down upon a moment, those great forces do not prefigure or predetermine all that will happen. They merely shape the context of the outcome. And of course, those great forces of history are merely another iteration of the same game. The way that Ada's final two became the final two is that in the real historic events that preceded the investiture of the Medici's Pope, a bunch of people played a version of this game for much higher stakes. And all of it is human action all the way down. And this I found to be a very inspiring revelation. Ada and I co-taught a lecture series at the university for 7 weeks a couple of years ago, which you can find online, about systems of control during information revolutions, where she taught about the Renaissance and I talked about the internet era. It was a very exciting time. And I came away from that with this idea that what distinguishes a disaster from a utopia is not what the external world is doing, not whether we have a zoonotic plague, not whether the ship is sinking, not whether there are wildfires, but what we do about it. That the disaster of the zombie movie is not the zombies. It's the fact that the commonplace of a zombie movie is that the minute the zombieism breaks out, you realize that even the people who aren't zombies were always bastards, and they're coming.
Yeah, you get elite panic.
Yeah. And I love the idea that if we have a crisis, we might rise to it. And I'm finishing a book now called The Lost Cause. That's a post-Green New Deal utopian novel about truth and reconciliation with white nationalist militias. And the thing that distinguishes it from a dystopia is not whether the world's on fire. The world is on fire. The last half of the book, no one can go outside because of the wildfires in Southern California. Their major project is relocating every coastal city in the world 20 kilometers inland, a project that they think will take 300 to 400 years. The difference is that they're doing it. The difference is they see the flood coming and they're like, all right, we've got to move the cities. They see the refugees coming. They're like, all right, we've got to build housing. They don't, run in circles flapping their arms and then act surprised when the crisis arrives. And that is the difference. It's the difference between having Jacinda Ardern and Boris Johnson running your pandemic response. The pandemic isn't going to be pleasant either way, but if you know that there's a grown-up who's figuring stuff out and that your neighbors can be trusted, well, then there you go. That is the difference between a utopia and a dystopia.
Yep.
Once again, we find ourselves in urgent agreement.
It's an attitude thing. The great tragedy of the past decade is we've had actually, since the great financial crisis of 2008, we've had a global drift towards right-wing authoritarianism all around the world. Many countries falling into the trap of having a strong maximum leader. I'm going to steer away from the Anglo-American experience for now because it speaks for itself. But look at Turkey, look at Hungary, look at Brazil, look at Thailand, look at the current revolution going on right now in Myanmar. It's all symptomatic of what I could almost speculate as being a vast right-wing international conspiracy, except they're too dumb to conspire with foreigners and too nationalist. But they all approach problems the same way. And the way they approach it is Hulk smash, not try and understand what they're dealing with and fix things. It's a huge tragedy of lost opportunity because we're in a decade when we really can't afford not to get to grips with the growing emergency of climate change. And these people, their approach to dealing with climate change is to figure out how to maximize the return on investment of the big assets they've got in the ground, the coal and the oil, rather than how to get off it as fast as possible.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I also think that there is this odd thing that happens where denialism turns into nihilism. And that's, again, an area where the stories we tell in science fiction make a big difference. So, if you have an actual problem and you don't actually deal with it, the problem will only get worse. And then there will come a time when you have to deal with it, right? I was a smoker for many years. and I eventually confronted the fact that smoking was not good for my health, I would have had to confront that eventually, no matter what. There would have come a time, if I'd lived long enough, when the doctor would have told me I had cancer, and then I would have had to have confronted the smoking. But so many smokers, when they get to that point, say, well, it's too late to quit. I might as well enjoy it, right? And this is like ignoring the crashing numbers of rhinos until there's only one left. And then you turn around and say, well, might as well find out what he tastes like, right? It's not like the species is coming back, right? This is our last chance. And that nihilism is, I think, upon us. I think we have gone seamlessly from a world in which the wealthy and powerful denied that climate change was real, or insisted that it could be remediated with technology not yet invented, that we could just sort of not only run across the river on the backs of alligators, but invent new alligators to run on while we cross the river in the event that the alligator supply ran out. But now we're at this point where they're like, actually, no, the crisis is coming, but we can weather it, right? If we retreat to high ground, if we build out our luxury bunkers, if we equip armies of militias to defend us, we can, breed our offspring by Harrier jet. We don't have a shared destiny with the rest of the world. And I think that's a tale straight out of the cozy catastrophe novels that dominated post-war British science fiction, the John Wyndham stories and On the Beach, Neville Shute, and so on, that I believe it was Brian Aldiss described rather disparagingly and said, these are stories about middle-class people returning to an age in which the working class knew their place, and in which the unpleasant existence of the working class is mitigated by most of them being killed off. And I think that that the stories that the luxury bunker builders tell themselves are echoes of those stories.
I'm going to go further and say the luxury bunker builders and the nihilism you've alluded to, they are side effects of a deep anxiety that the privileged existence of these people cannot be sustained any further. And in most cases, privilege is relative privilege. An issue with empaths is they rise, they inevitably fall and are replaced by other empaths, but the people who live in them are seldom poorer or worse off than they were after the empath's gone away. What has happened is another country has risen to imperial hegemonic power and has supplanted them, but the survivors are still relatively comfortable. What they don't have is the degree of influence that they were used to. And people who have become used to privilege, to being big and powerful and everybody pays attention to them, really don't like it when they stop being center stage. We're seeing chunks of it breaking out all over in various social phenomena, such as, well, hell, as a case in point, the Black Lives Matter thing, the white backlash against it is screamingly terrified of any loss of relative status. Same is happening with all sorts of other social phenomena this decade. It seems to come up pretty much randomly. Sorry, I've just been replaced on my screen by a... right, back again. Cory?
Yeah, no, I'm here.
Oh, okay.
You hear me? Sorry, I had my mic on mute.
Right. So yeah, nihilism tends to go with the perception of an inevitable decline, but the decline is an illusion. It's not an absolute decline. If you were to go back in time 150 years and as a time traveler from the future and have breakfast with H.G. Wells, and obviously you don't want any temporal paradoxes to occur in this scenario, so you let Mr. Wells know you're a time traveler and that he can ask you questions about the time you come from, but you can only give him a yes or no answer. What is Mr. Wells going to ask you about? Well, does the British Empire still rule the world? No. Ooh, okay. Does the British Empire still dominate the world in exports of... No. Is the Royal Navy still the largest navy in the world? No. Does the British Empire still... Does the UK still mine coal? No. Huh? What? You mean civilization's collapsed? No. And so on. The questions he would be asking would be framed in the terms of, say, 1890, and he wouldn't know the right questions to ask to actually evaluate the future. Similarly, people who are used to thinking in terms of petrochemical industries and extraction and geopolitics determined by who has the oil fields are not thinking of the right questions to ask about a world dominated by solar power. Photovoltaic panels are getting cheap so ridiculously fast that we've now reached a point where it is cheaper to install new photovoltaic power stations than it is to mine existing coal reserves and burn them in existing coal plants for power. But the geographical distribution of solar power is different from the geographical distribution of coal or of oil. This has huge geopolitical implications going forward. The whole reason for the mess in the Middle East goes back to the 1890s and the 1900s, and First Lord of the Admiralty, Jackie Fisher's decision to move the Royal Navy to run on heavy bunker oil burned to power steam turbines in ships. He did this following a military campaign in 1905 to 1906 by the Russian Navy. Quick recap, there was a war in 1905 when a Russian foreign minister decided that to distract attention from a near revolution, they should pick a small punk country and beat them up to rally morale. They should have a short victorious war. So he picked on Japan. This did not end well for Russia. So having lost one fleet and having an army group encircled near Vladivostok, the Russians sent their Baltic fleet all the way, the long way round Africa to the Sea of Japan, at which point they were promptly sunk by the Japanese because they weren't very good, let's face it. In the process, they invented refueling at sea. They transferred 250,000 tons of coal between coal-carrying cargo ships and battleships, and they discovered that this was a really terrible way to run a fleet at sea. The British watched this and decided, we need oil. Where's the oil? Oh, the Persian Gulf. Cue an entire century of really shitty, stupid, horrible political blunders, leading first to Britain getting involved in carving up the Middle East after gutting the Ottoman Empire, a stitch-up job with France and the Sykes-Picot Treaty, then dominating Persia, or Iran as it became known, and, well, effectively running a puppet monarchy, handed the baton over to the United States in 1953, not without an awful lot of arm twisting, because the United States wanted oil as well. And oil is basically an addictive drug for energy economies. It's fungible, it is easily transportable, and it can be pumped. It's not like coal, which is kind of difficult to ship around and move. Oil is fluid. Solar isn't fluid, at least not unless you use it to generate storable synthetic fuels using the Fischer-Tropsch synthesis. You can make methane and long-chain hydrocarbons out of electricity from any source, plus carbon dioxide and water. You can do this using photovoltaic cells. I've got a feeling that our airliners are still going to be flying and still burning kerosene in 100 years' time. It's just, it will be carbon neutral kerosene, but synthetic. It won't be pumped out of the ground. But anyway, the energy economics of a solar-powered world look very different to the energy economics of an oil-powered world. And I don't think that message has sunk in yet, or rather, it's sunk in with some of the people who are moving and shaking, and they're petrified that their existing oil reserves are going to be worthless within a decade. And that leads to a certain nihilism in the approach.
Yeah, and it creates these odd power situations that make for interesting fictional possibilities or scenario plans. So I'm a Canadian, and everyone in the world is in love with our prime minister, the hunky fellow who's part of a political legacy and has the good hair and the pecs and goes kayaking and so on. But and Justin Trudeau, to his credit, has endorsed some incredibly progressive policies. And there seems to be no policy so progressive he won't endorse it, so long as he never has to do anything to make it a reality. So Trudeau ran as this kind of cuddly fellow who wanted to save the world, but he also gave a speech to our oil industry saying no country on earth is going to leave 70 trillion barrels of oil in the ground that's going to get dug up and burned. And this is by way of saying we will roast the planet. Canadian oil is the worst oil in the world. I know that's really saying something, but bituminous sand requires that you burn almost an entire barrel of oil to liberate a barrel of oil. And so its carbon footprint is especially terrible. It's like making spotted owl omelets or something. And and so here you have Justin Trudeau, who takes office. He takes the pipeline that Obama had killed, the Dakota Access Pipeline that people protested for and stood on the line for, and that Indigenous people insisted that they would get rid of, and that finally they were victorious on. And he bails them out. He brings them into public ownership so that they can continue to build this pipeline through Indigenous lands, having run on a campaign of truth and reconciliation with Indigenous people. And after all of that, when Greta Thunberg came to Canada on her wind-powered sailboat, carbon-neutral wind-powered sailboat, and marched at the front of a climate march, Justin Trudeau marched with her against his own policies. And I think that there were many of us who said, Justin, if only you knew someone who was in a position of power in Canada. Mr. Prime Minister, if only you knew someone who held some sway over the minister with the file to dig up Canada's horrible climate-destroying oil and do something about it. But this was the seed of a story I wrote, of this novel I'm working on, this Truth and Reconciliation post-Green New Deal novel, is that eventually this opens up some political space that is currently closed, that there are things that are unthinkable for certain people. As you say, Charlie, there are people for whom the idea that you will walk away from some energy source or make the future not like the past in some important way, that those people cannot imagine it because of the consequences that would attend such a shift. It's not that their imagination is too small, it's that it's too expansive. They understand that the shift would be attended by further shifts, dominoes that fell over, that would redound to their great detriment, that it would really hurt them, even if it helped the rest of us. And so when you have an establishment for whom certain necessary, obvious things are unthinkable, then you also have an opportunity for reformation that is willing to do the thing no one is willing to do. You know, there's that Brian Eno quote from the Oblique Strategies deck: be the first person to not do something that no one else has ever thought of not doing. And, you know, govern without digging up Canada's filthy oil is a thing that no prime minister has ever tried doing. And it makes you wonder what would happen if they did. You know, I think we're about to find out in 2 to 4 years what happens in the US if you govern as though money was endogenous to governments and that sovereign currency issues couldn't run out of it, and that all it is a way of keeping score, and that sovereign currency issuers don't have to pay their debts the way households do, because they made the money and then they annihilate the money when they tax it, and then they make some more when they spend it again. And I think we're about to find out whether or not someone who is liberated from the live within our means Thatcherite, there is no such thing as the government's money, there is only taxpayers' money. If when you're liberated from that, you cannot find yourself with an enduring political advantage that shifts the entire political calculus. And that's what I mean by living in an unpredictable age being a somewhat hopeful thing.
Yeah, we tend to find it very, very difficult to get our heads around paradigm shifts. As Herman Kahn observed when he was writing about the structure of scientific revolutions, you usually have to wait for an entire generation of elderly scientists to die off before suddenly the orthodoxy shifts completely. And, for example, tectonic drift was hypothesized as an explanation in geology for why the distribution of fossils and strata in different continents seem to match up weirdly. It goes back to about the 19-teens to 1920s. It did not become the orthodoxy until the 1960s. But it then opinion shifted very, very rapidly in a period of about 10 years, as I understand it. Again, not a geologist here. This is my layman's understanding of it, which may be wrong. And I think the same goes with trends in economics as well. We're living at the end of about a 40-year experiment with neoliberalism, the roots of which go back 20, 30 years before that. And there's a strangely Brezhnevite late Soviet feel to the way economics is discussed in the West. It's particularly obtrusive in Brexit land, the UK. Brexit wasn't even on the political radar a decade ago. It was an internal esoteric squabble among some conservative ideologues that was ranked about number 12 on a list of public concerns. You know, do you want to leave the EU? About 4% of the population were interested in it, way below the health service, unemployment benefits, financial crisis. It was artificially hyped up and sold to the public as a solution to something, to an entirely different set of problems, and that were amplified by a very right-wing reactionary media environment. And that represents a paradigm shift in the way British politics is best understood, one that is actually threatening to tear the whole of the UK apart. I am in Scotland, where polling for independence has now hit, well, opinion polls have a majority of the population willing to vote for independence. In Northern Ireland, it's getting close to that level. In Wales, which has been part of England and Wales for 700 years, 30 to 40% of the population want to leave the UK. I mean, this is ridiculous. This wouldn't have been on the radar 5 years ago, and it's a side effect of one of these very strange paradigm shifts, which has been largely driven by a goal of a large chunk of the British investment sector who want to turn the UK into essentially a tax haven. By getting out from under EU regulations on money laundering, by leaving the European financial system, they believe they can actually make bank as an offshore place where people will do the financial transactions and move all their deposits around. And it's representing a very weird paradigm shift in how the UK is perceived at different levels by its own establishment. It's no longer an imperial power. The empire pulled down the flag over Hong Kong in 1996. A generation later, we're now seeing them try and move their pet fiefdom, because they think of it as a country they own, in an entirely different direction for a different purpose. Where this is going to end up, I don't know, but my suspicion is it's going to end up as a whole bunch of small squabbling states with different agendas, some of which are going to go in very different directions.
So it's funny you mention money laundering. I think that, one of the underappreciated areas that and underexplored areas for science fiction is finance crime. And particularly we've had like a decade of just both literally and figuratively spectacular finance leaks, Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, Lux leaks, and so on. And these leaks have had huge political consequences and have included the kind of thing that you could really easily make into a science fiction novel, like assassinations, where journalists who reported on them in Malta was car bombed by thugs hired by rich people. And the thing that Lux leaks and the other leak packages, as well as the works of economists like Gabriel Zucman and Thomas Piketty, his mentor, have revealed, is that most of the economy is an off-the-books economy. That the money is all kind of moving through these dark silos, and there have been ways that it has extruded into the physical world. You walk through Mayfair and a third of the flats are dark of an evening because they're just safe deposit boxes in the sky. Same goes for the Shard and those other tall buildings. New York is the same.
I have a novel which is basically riffing on that. Okay, it's an urban fantasy and a political satire, but the whole point of real estate as investment vehicles rather than actual habitation is the armature of that whole thing. It's impossible to avoid. You can't tackle the present or the near future without acknowledging it.
Well, and then this brings me to a question that was raised by Haida Goody that Aaron was kind enough to stick in the chat here, which is views on non-fungible tokens. And I think that there's a bunch of obvious things to say, like they're a climate disaster and they're stupid. But there's another thing to say, which is that speculative markets that are vast and that appear out of nowhere and just go wild are the hallmark not just of a bubble, but also of a bubble being protective coloration for money laundering. And, you know, certainly like the London property bubble was a money laundering bubble. You know,
also the bubble economy in Old Masters' great works of art.
100%. Yeah.
If somebody in the Saudi royal family buys a painting for $200 million, it's not worth $200 million, but it does mean $200 million can legitimately be converted into cash in another country.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I'm just looking up this article that came out this morning, or that I read this morning about this, that the U.S. hang on a second, the U.S. Is now, because they're requiring beneficial ownership disclosures on certain kinds of LLCs, certain paintings can no longer be sold in the U.S. because their true owners would then be disclosed and then be liable for taxation on the basis of it. When these paintings change hands, it is a market that looks a lot like the NFT market, because it's a market in nothing. So most of these paintings are in climate-controlled shipping containers, secure shipping containers in the free port of Geneva. And when I buy a painting from you, all that happens is title is transferred from me to you. And the NFT market, what the NFT market is it's a market in you indelibly recording that a file at a certain web address is a file that you accepted some money in exchange for indelibly recording that there's a file at that address from me. That's all that we've done, right? You haven't transferred title to the image or the file. There's been no actual transaction that's taken place that produced social value. It is a market in attestations that the market exists, and it's an incredibly fragile one, or at least an incredibly fallacious one. You know, if you want to understand just how fake the NFT market is, consider that the thing that you notionally buy is the permanent record of a web address, actually address in IPFS, the Interplanetary File System, which is a distributed file system. So Charlie, if you were to record yourself farting as someone just did and put it up for auction as an NFT, and I bought it from you, what I would actually have is like a cryptographic hash that said, this identifier associated with Cory Doctorow gave some money to this identifier belonging to Charlie Stross for a file at this address. But the thing is that the web host that hosts that address can disappear. And they do. There's been huge numbers of disappearing web hosts in the nascent NFT market, where these servers that host the only part of this that is remotely a valuable thing, which is maybe someone will derive pleasure from the sound of a fart or a JPEG or an animated GIF, and it is pronounced GIF, I'll die on that hill, that part of it is completely fluid. There's no means of establishing its permanence, and indeed quite the reverse. Because the blockchain entry is indelible, you can't update it. If the server goes down and they put the file somewhere else, you will forever point at a file that doesn't exist. It is a really remarkable piece of bubblenomics.
It's bubblenomics, and it makes less sense for the Dutch 18th century tulip bulb craze, because at least tulip bulbs were physical things. And Cory finally got to the one word that I think renders it completely irredeemably toxic, which is blockchain. The problem is proof of work requires an exponentially increasing amount of energy to be expended on calculations. If blockchain was doing something useful, like solving protein folding computations, I would at least have some time for it. But I can't help thinking, whenever I look at blockchain and Bitcoin in particular, this was designed by a libertarian ideologue of the traditional gold bug variety, who wanted specifically to undermine government's ability to issue fiat currency and to collect tax, and who wanted to provide a bypass specifically for tax avoidance, and didn't care about the damage that it would cause in the long term. It's grotesquely destructive, and it doesn't even do anything particularly useful for us. I'm sure we can come up with cryptocurrencies that don't destroy the environment in the process, or at least do something that we all agree is useful in the process of consuming huge amounts of energy. But the blockchain is not it. In this case, it's based on Ethereum, which is an attempt at doing something useful with smart contracts, but really it's what I see as people who just get very, very enthusiastic about the latest collector's fad. And what were those collectible electronic pets from a few years ago?
Not Pokemon, Tamagotchi.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking of Tamagotchi specifically, but I was thinking of a later iteration where they're entirely virtual objects.
E-pets or something?
E-pets, yeah. It's glorified e-pets, and it's accidentally blown up into an economy of ridiculous size, and it's consuming the energy, roughly the same amount of energy as Austria or Argentina or somewhere at this point.
Yeah.
This has got beyond the joke.
And I think that this is that the only quibble I would have with that characterization is sort of out of the blue. I actually, or for some reason, I think that I hypothesize that there's a very good reason for the liquidity in this otherwise irrational market, which is that it is economically rational for money launderers who have stolen money and want to make it into clean money to participate in otherwise very wasteful markets. And,
yes.
and that is often the case. I will say, trying to channel my cryptocurrency friends, that they will say, oh, well, there's proof of stake, which is better and better for the climate, although there's been no meaningful action on it. And then there are new cryptocurrencies that rely on trusted computing and remote attestation, which it happens to be the theme of the other novel I'm writing right now, which is called Red Team Blues. And it's a book about a forensic accountant tracking down money launderers who steal secure attestation keys for the secure enclaves in phones so that they can rewrite a cryptographic ledger to help them launder money, and the murders that kicks off. So I think that money laundering is symptomatic. To try and tie this back together, because we're coming low on time here, tie this all back together. The Libertarian Exit Project is a long project, right? The project of walking away from the peons who, there's far too many of them that are needed, strictly speaking, to keep our toilets clean. So most of them can just go hang, and finding a nation where you can write your own laws that acknowledge the divine right of markets and so on. That project is a very old one. And it's very intimately related to the cozy apocalypse, and it's very intimately related to the bunker building projects of the 21st century. And it is something that science fiction has been very kind to, that owes a great debt to science fiction, from Atlas Shrugged to Heinlein novels to all sorts of space exploration books. And that the project of taking money out of the hands of democratically elected legislatures and moving them to these distributed systems that are controlled by rich people, that is, I think, best seen as part of that project.
Yep, absolutely. You've always got to look for the political agenda behind a depiction of the future. Who are the people who have an interest in promoting this vision of the future? Don't look at it uncritically. Also, the attitude of protagonists in works of fiction tells you a lot about what's going on under the hood. Elite panic is the phenomena whereby people with with assets at stake, in the face of a civil disaster, such as an earthquake or climate change or plague, tend to fort up and point shotguns at everybody around them rather than pitching in and trying to help everybody. We know that in real disasters, people actually tend to help their neighbors. They look after each other. Elite panic is the exact opposite, and it seems to be a reflex that is disproportionately encountered among the wealthy and privileged. It's an odd failure of empathy. And I think the one thing that we do need more of in the future is empathy all around. Otherwise, if we don't hang together, we're going to hang separately.
I think that's very well said. I was vastly inspired by the book where I first encountered the idea of elite panic, which is A Paradise Built in Hell, written by Rebecca Solnit, the historian, who documents the way in which people pitch in. How when the crisis emerges, the thing that's most likely to happen is not that your neighbor will come over with a gun. It's that your neighbor will come over with a casserole dish of whatever would go off in the fridge so that you and they can share before it spoils. And that my hope for science fiction and my fear of science fiction is this idea that it's an intuition pump. And that if we have been convinced by narrative that elite panic is right, that elite panic is the most likely outcome, that your neighbors are coming over with a gun, then you'd be a fool to answer the door with a covered dish. But contrariwise, I think that if we tell stories that are not about disaster being averted, but disaster being confronted, not about a world where nothing goes wrong, but about a world where things go wrong, we can get them going. You know, a world where the Titanic still sinks, but the engineers had the foresight to put enough lifeboats on at that time. You know, that is an intuition pump that doesn't just tell a good corking story. It does. The disagreements among people of goodwill that are irreconcilable are much harder dramatically. They're much harder on the characters than disagreements with people you don't like. Disagreeing with people you like very much and not being able to come to an agreement and having those disagreements be foundational and shatter your bond, that is a hugely dramatic moment that any pulp writer worth their salt should be really leaning into.
Yeah, the best conflicts I find in fiction are between ones where antagonists on both sides are acting from the best of intentions and acting rationally within the parameters that they can see.
This is something you do so well in those family trade books, where you have these characters who are superficially quite villainous sort of tyrants, and then the closer you get to them, the more you learn that they're also worried about the political instability that stepping away from this tyrannical role would have, and they've sort of, you know, to a certain extent it's rationalization, but there's also an awful lot of like actual good faith stuff here. So I want to close it out then and say that your neighbors are the solution, not the problem. That the future is unknowable, and that's good. That the future is ours to inscribe. That it's not an individual project; it's a collective project, and that we will do it not through war of all against all, but through cooperation and collaboration.
I'm going to agree with all of that and just add as well, when reading depictions of the future, always try and keep one eye on the cognitive biases of the author. What agenda are they trying to promote? What agenda are they taking for granted? That's about it from me, I guess.
Because we authors are frail mediocrities, just like everybody else. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for coming today. And thanks, Charlie. What a treat to see you again.
Thank you. Yeah, likewise.
Can't wait till we can all be in person again.
Yeah. Thanks for...